Okay, thank you for the invite. And I was asked to speak on three what seem to be not related topics, but to me are very closely related with respect to canola production. And one of those is canola stand densities. And as Jay mentioned, one of my interests is plant spatial arrangement. A little bit about some new herbicide-resistant weeds discovered in Western Canada. And I've got a slide in there as well about herbicide performance and trying to explain why herbicides sometimes, particularly under adverse weather conditions, don't quite perform as well as we would like them to. So I'll start first with a little bit about spatial arrangement of plants. And of course, this is near and dear to my heart because it affects plant competition and the ability of plants to compete with weeds, but also affects just straightforward crop production. So even under weed-free settings, spatial arrangement and particularly gaps in the crop canopy are very important for a couple of reasons. Number one, they allow weeds to germinate and compete. And number two, those gaps in the canopy aren't really using sunlight, and so they can actually lead to reduced yields. And I'll talk a little bit about this, these experiments we've been involved with Steve Shurtleff. And in my lab, we've done these in other crops as well. But this is canola overhead shot of this suite of experiments we're doing at the moment, where we're looking at a whole range of densities and a whole suite of different row spacings. And you can obviously tell from this shot that some of these stands of canola are much better able to compete with weeds or have built a much better solar collector with respect to forming yield than others. And I'll share some of the data here very briefly. This is from the 2018 Carbon site, but the rest of them look very similar. And the interesting thing here is that we noticed, and we shouldn't really be surprised by that, is canola is an incredibly plastic plant. It can deal with a whole plethora of row spacings and densities and still produce very equivalent yields or similar yields. What we've noticed, and this goes across all the experiments and the data I've seen so far, is that narrow row spacings and all the way up to about 22 inches, give or take, have the same yield response curve. And so the canola plants are able to use that space. Although maybe from a weed management perspective, that might not always be the right choice to go with these extra wide row spacings. And the yield response curve basically looks like this. Around 50 plants per meter squared, somewhere in there 50 to 60, we hit the plateau of the yield response curve. And any extra plants over here will buy us some biological insurance. And I think that's very important from weed competition perspective, even from even looking at other biotic stresses, insects, diseases, as well as abiotic stresses, such as frost or drought. These buy us a little bit of a cushion with respect to maintaining performance if something happens. If we're operating close to what I always say, the cliff of this curve, and some people certainly are, and I'll show you in a minute that it's probably more than we would like to see. If we're operating close to the cliff here, anything that goes bad and we can't fix it very quickly with either pesticide or some other input, and we're going to be sliding off that yield curve very quickly, and we're not going to attain maximum yields. The wider row spacings, 30 inches, just don't work for canola. It's just too wide a row, and they simply aren't able to compensate for that. But it's quite surprising how well they're able to compensate over this broad range of row spacings as it is. Now, if we look at these stands themselves, we see that they look very different. Here we've got a 7.5 inch row spacing stand, and there's not a lot of bare ground to be seen. So from a weed competition perspective, this is fantastic. On the other hand, when we get to 22.5 inches or 15-inch row spacing, we can still pull off some fantastic yields, but we need very good weed control here. And the herbicide is going to have to work a whole lot harder to manage the weeds in these stands than it does in this type of scenario. And I'll throw this out right now. I've been thinking about this for a long time, but we've had canola with herbicide-resistant canola systems as long as corn and soybean have been available. Yet the number of herbicide-resistant weeds that we could really pinpoint to selecting for in these canola systems have been virtually nil. Whereas in the corn and soybean systems, there are a lot of herbicide-resistant weeds that are attributed to the herbicide use in those systems. And I would argue it's because canola is so competitive and because we still are producing it like this type of a crop rather than that type of a crop that's really made canola a very sustainable system with respect to herbicide resistance. Now, not only is the spacing between rows very important, but uniformity within rows is very important as well. And that speaks to the germination question. That's still a big question that needs to be answered at some point. But if we look at these studies where we looked at holes in rows with Yan Tai, essentially what we found is that you need to be operating near 80 plants per meter squared to maximize your yield potential under non-uniform stands. In high yielding situations, you can get away with a whole lot less. Not so in low yielding situations, but in these non-uniform stands, we do need more plants per meter squared to make up for that shortfall. This is just a frequency response of the canola densities in 206 different farm fields. And what I want to show you with this is that if you're a canola producer, and I would very strongly encourage you at the end of the season just to do a quick stubble count to see where your field fits into this. Remember I was saying that we need sort of 60 plus plants per meter squared to maximize our yields in many cases. We can get away with a little less if everything else is favorable. But if you look at these densities across the spectrum, about half the fields, this was our harvest loss survey from almost a decade ago, but half the fields of canola in Western Canada across the 3 prairie provinces are operating below that 60 plants per meter squared and may not be maximizing yield potential. The reason that I point out these wider row spacings, there is some interest in going to wider row spacings in canola as there are in other crops. The challenge with that is, and the point to our discoveries of the first glyphosate-resistant kochia that was found in Manitoba. We thought it was going to come in from the west where it had been much more prominent, but in reality, the first survey of Roundup resistant kochia in Manitoba showed us that it occurred in 2 wide row crops. One was a cornfield by Elm Creek, and the other one was a soybean field close to the US border. And as you can see here, these are injured plants, and they, of course, have full access to light. If the canopy doesn't close, these are going to reproduce, produce some seed, and they're going to multiply the resistant seed bank. If, on the other hand, if we have a canopy that closes here completely, these plants will be choked out by the better performing soybean, canola, whatever crop plants they might be, and they won't be able to reproduce. So there'll be no seed production, and the crop is doing its share of the weed control as we would like it to. Couple of notes on new herbicide-resistant weeds that we need to keep an eye out for. Some of you have probably heard about these already. Water hemp is in Manitoba now. Here's the map. And Kim will probably talk a little bit more about identification of these 2 weeds. And Palmer amaranth was discovered in Manitoba in one field last summer. These are both in the amaranth family. They are very troublesome weeds. Water hemp has been in North Dakota for quite a while, and it's resistant not only to glyphosate, but a whole host of things. In Illinois, I think they are testing now, or may have even confirmed, a single population of water hemp that's resistant to 8 different modes of action. So there really isn't a lot of, there aren't a lot of control options left with a population like that. And the Palmer amaranth is its more aggressive cousin from the southern states. Maybe during the question section, we can talk a little bit more about why and how it came to the northern states, but I'll leave it at that for now. The other weed of concern, of course, across Western Canada is glyphosate or Roundup resistant kochia. And not only is all the kochia in Western Canada resistant to group 2s, a good portion of it now is resistant to glyphosate, and that portion has increased quite dramatically from one survey to the next. But now in Alberta, they've also discovered dicamba and fluroxypyr resistance. So we've got 3-way resistance in kochia. Shouldn't really be a big surprise because way back in the day when I was a poor summer student, I'm not going to date myself, but at that point, when the first flush of herbicide resistance went through Manitoba, we were already looking at group 4 resistance in kochia. It's always been a little tricky controlling kochia with group 4s, and so resistance was never far away. Now that we are out of other groups and we're relying more heavily on the group 4s, the resistance levels are increasing. And that certainly is a concern as groups are disappearing with respect to being able to manage that weed. Last but not least, in terms of newly discovered weeds, those of you in Alberta have probably seen this already, and those who have listened to Charles Geddes talk have seen this already, but and that I think he presented it at the MAC conference as well. But this is the newest find in Western Canada, our first glyphosate-resistant grass. We were always expecting it to be wild oats. Luckily, it's not. It's downy brome. And that was discovered in southern Alberta somewhere. I don't quite know the cropping history, but this population is 10 times more resistant to glyphosate than the susceptible population. So again, it's a potentially serious challenge with respect to managing this weed with glyphosate alone, obviously. And last but not least, I'll speak a little bit about herbicide performance and adverse weather conditions. Herbicide doses and rates are designed to work under mostly normal conditions. And so sometimes when we run into these adverse weather conditions, things just don't quite perform as we expect them to. This is an interesting slide that was put together, and it's in the herbicide handbook or something like that put out by Alberta Ag quite a few years ago. And it basically goes from atomization, which is on top, that's the tip of the nozzle, right down to the target site in the plant. And there are a lot of places where we can lose the herbicide or where something can happen to the herbicide along this path. And the leaf surface being one of these real barriers to herbicide performance and uptake. So we've got some percentages here from a study that looked at radio-labeled herbicide, and of 100% that was applied, 65% never hit the target plant, so only 34% of the herbicide hit the target plant. Of those 100%, only 5% went into the plant and only 2.2% got to the target site. And that was enough and is enough to cause the plants to die and do the biological effect. So that the losses along the way are quite dramatic. Now, if we're talking about, and the other thing to point out here is that 28.6% of the total herbicide after 3 days was still found on the leaf surface. And the real big barrier for herbicides to get into the plant is the leaf surface. The leaf surface is made up of waxes, the cuticle. The plant puts those waxes on to prevent water loss. Unfortunately, most herbicides have an incredibly tough time getting through that cuticle. And under dry conditions, a couple things that work against that, and that is the cuticle becomes much thicker. So there's more wax to go through for the herbicide. And if it does get into the plants are also not growing actively. And if the plants aren't growing actively, then the herbicide isn't able, because most herbicides rely on plant growth or affect plant growth. If the plant isn't really growing, the herbicide can't do its job. And so oftentimes it's sequestered away in the plant or it's detoxified. And so there's a couple of these very important things, the thicker cuticle and the reduced plant growth that can affect herbicide performance under these adverse weather conditions or dry conditions. In wet conditions, it's the exact opposite. The cuticle is really thin, the plant is growing like mad, and so under wet conditions, we can often see, or will often see, crop injury at our normal herbicide dose because more herbicide gets into the plant. We'll see what this year brings. This spring, it's certainly in southern Manitoba, we've got a lot of snow. We might be looking at hyperactive herbicides this spring. It's kind of hard to tell. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say for now, and pass it on to the next presenter. Thank you.
Right on. Thanks, Rob.